What are the symptoms of a trauma? Well, firstly, let me define trauma. So a trauma is the wound that's created from a really distressing event. So the trauma is the physiological emotion or response that the human has. And the traumatic experience is the thing that happens. So today I'm going to talk about the wound that this distressing experience can cause us. Now, this is psychological wound. Now, how do we recognise that this wound is present? Sometimes we don't even know it's present. Sometimes we can see it in others. So it can be hard to recognise, and often it can have a scar to protect it as well. It's like if we had a wound in our body, a leg, and somebody poked it, we'd react with pain. And it's the same with the trauma. When it gets poked, when it gets touched, we can react with pain. And it's this reaction that suggests there's an underlying trauma, underlying kind of wound. Whether many people do deny, minimise, or even avoid acknowledging that the wound is there, it's just too painful. And it's only through supporting somebody to look deeper at why they're reacting like this can we say that maybe there's a trauma there. So how do we tell if this wound is underneath the surface? Well, there's different areas that we can look at to recognise it. It covers quite a lot of things, so I'm just going to touch into them. Now, firstly, relationships can be an indicator. Are we choosing unhealthy relationships? Difficulty saying no, people pleasing, maybe jumping from one job to another, struggling to hold down relationships, or maybe seeing people as aggressive or hurtful when that's not necessarily what their language is. Maybe they're not displaying that, but we're kind of laying that down onto them and then seeing that back at us. This can be similar to an inability to hear criticism as well, particularly if it's done in a constructive way. Actually, what that can be doing is it can be maybe touching a trauma, and that's why that person's reacting, and it's showing in their kind of interpersonal relationships. So another one is physical. So we could have eating disturbances, maybe binge eating, compulsive eating, or restricting. And that can be because there's a relationship born about food, maybe food deprivation, that creates a very painful emotional reaction. And then by eating more, we're trying to push down this emotional reaction. But that's a whole video in itself. I'll talk more on eating and trauma. But also restricting, when people restrict food, that can be a way of control, can also be a way of controlling their inner pain. So eating disturbances are really often significantly linked to trauma. So we can have sleep difficulties, sleeping too much or trouble sleeping. Sleeping can be a way of blocking out painful emotions that can come from trauma. There could be sexual problems, there could be energy problems, unexplained chronic illness or pain. A lot of these can come out of having many early experiences of trauma. There can be emotional symptoms. These can be the usual things: low mood, depression, maybe crying for no apparent reason, despair, hopelessness that doesn't necessarily warrant it in the situation, anxiety. There could be excessive fears, feeling out of control, maybe rage, irritability, anger, resentment, or particularly intense guilt. This difficulty in finding contentment and calm, that can be a sign that there's some underlying trauma that's really fueling all these different behaviours. Also, we could have numbness, detachment, not feeling any emotions at all. This can be what we call splitting off parts of the self. So they're actually not being in touch with the part that's really hurting and the trauma part, or doing things that they're not remembering, maybe dissociation, or there could be deep shame about the self, but that's split off and not really acknowledged as well. But trauma can be around. So detachment and numbness are really quite an important symptom to be aware of. So there could be behaviours as well that can show there's trauma around, such as intentionally hurting yourself, or seemingly really impulsive behaviours, self-harm, acting in really compulsive or impulsive ways, and having particular cognitive thoughts, self-loathing, and kind of disproportionate self-blame to things, self-criticism, fearful, really fearful negative thinking that's over and above maybe what the situation actually requires, intense need to defend yourself, particularly if you feel that you can't possibly be in the wrong. That can be underlying trauma as well, and an ability to think, well, I need to be perfect, otherwise I'm unsafe. And then often people who really cling to being perfect and can't hear any criticism, that's actually a trauma underlying that as well. It's that inflexibility that I mentioned before. So that's 4 areas where trauma symptoms can be shown. 1 or 2 can show up. You're not necessarily going to have all of them. It could be maybe you have an argument with somebody and then you're living in a bit of a dream world. You're dissociating and you can't think, you can't access how you feel. That shows that something maybe you've got triggered from that argument. Maybe going to a certain place and just being really angry and really irritable and not knowing why. That could be because something about that location you're going to is triggering something, a trauma from the past. Certain times of year people can have this, that they get really intense emotions for no reason. And there's much more significant symptoms of trauma as well, and that's what we see in PTSD, and I've mentioned those before in other videos. They are really noticeable. You're getting flashbacks to the event, you're getting intrusive memories, you're getting nightmares, you're getting floods of unexpected emotion, hypervigilant, hyperarousal we call it, always on edge. And I'll talk another video about PTSD. We don't necessarily have to have PTSD to have been traumatized by something to have the symptoms of trauma. They can be much more subtle. And often when people come into clinic, if there's something that they're struggling with, anxiety or depression, often there can be some trauma underneath that, and very slowly we peel back the layers until we can find out what that is and start to work through it. If you found this helpful, please subscribe. And if you feel like you would like some support, I'm the clinical director of Malvern Hills Private Practice, and you can fill out the self-referral form and be seeing a therapist really quickly within a week or so. That's remote or face-to-face in Worcestershire, the Midlands. Thank you.